I'm joined today by Matt Shapo, Director of Digital Audio and Video at the IAB. Matt, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
It is absolutely my pleasure. It's nice to see you. How are you today?
I'm doing well.
Good.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the state of digital audio and how the IAB views it in its current form today.
So the state of digital audio, as you and I have talked about, a couple of times over the last couple of weeks, I think is extremely strong right now. IAB as a whole, as you know, is a trade association that is dedicated to helping the entire digital marketing ecosystem thrive. And within that, digital audio, I think, is becoming an increasingly important area for not only those of us at IAB, but throughout membership to focus on when it comes to finding proper alignment for advertising messages on behalf of all of our buy-side membership at the IAB.
I've seen reports from eMarketer lately that show digital audio ad spend is expected to increase by 50% over the next 2 years. Digital audio spend is going to exceed $1.8 billion over the next 2 years. What do you think is driving that growth?
Well, I think that it will come as no surprise to anybody watching this that a big force behind the growth in any medium, certainly digital audio in particular, is just the incredible stickiness of the content and the extent to which it resonates with the people that are consuming it, right? So in audio particularly, you're talking about a medium that is consumed throughout somebody's day. They might wake up and be listening to some sort of music to kind of set the tone and get them going. Later in the afternoon, they might be taking a little bit of a lunch break and catching up on the news. Maybe they get to later in the afternoon and they're listening to a favorite podcast to sort of like dive into a particular interest that they may have and want to learn more about. It is just an incredibly sticky medium where people are going, as I say, throughout the day to get the kind of quality entertainment, information, education that they're looking for. And you can't really sort of beat that when it comes to the growth of a medium, right? If you have people that are leaning into content because they love it, they're going to consume more of it, and the growth is just going to naturally follow.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting you bring that up about the multiple touch points throughout the day. We've seen from partners that are utilizing DCO, right, for dynamic creative optimizations and actually delivering the right ad at the right moment through the day. We've seen performance increase significantly. So it's important to keep in mind when advertisers are building out a campaign to keep the creative in mind and when they're going to touch that end listener, because there are so many different touch points throughout the day. I think you've also seen over the past few years an increase in where audio can be delivered, right?
Yep.
3 years ago, in-game audio wasn't a thing. Audio articles were just establishing themselves as a format. Podcasts were not as established, right? So between streaming audio, podcasts, and then, what we look at as emerging formats, which is audio everywhere else, I think the growth in that inventory has been, and the performance of that inventory has paid off for advertisers, leading to additional spend in the channel.
Yeah, and I think it becomes sort of like, a reinforcing cycle over time, right? So some of the performance you talk about, one of the things that we concentrate a lot on at IAB is outcomes, regardless of channel. And one of the things that we are seeing more and more is that as more brand advertisers lean into audio, they are finding that the outcomes that they can achieve in the channel are remarkable, right? So you see benchmark beating returns, across the digital audio spectrum, whether you're talking about music streaming, whether you're talking about podcasting, online radio consumption, over and over again. We are seeing that there are tools to not only measure outcomes, but then the ability to understand more broadly, just in the last couple of years, what the incremental contributions of digital audio ad campaigns are alongside other channels. This is sort of one of the last frontiers that we're working on a lot, both at IAB and throughout the industry as a whole, is becoming better able to understand, better able first to measure, and then better able to compare the outcomes that you're getting in audio to the outcomes that you're getting in some of the other channels that you're marketing in, and understand really how strong audio's returns can be.
We see a shift in how audio ad budgets are being spent from the managed service side into programmatic. From your perspective, as sort of a neutral third party here, how has the IAB seen the growth in programmatic over the past few years, particularly around audio?
So we obviously spend a great deal of our time trying to solve for friction points throughout the industry involving programmatic activation. We have noticed, as has everybody else in the digital marketing ecosystem, a great deal of additional interest in activating programmatically within digital audio. We are starting to notice for the first time ever truly what I would describe as significant inclination toward programmatic activation in podcasting, which was really wonderful to see. Last year, for instance, we produced 2 parts. We've historically done a podcast ad revenue study every year at IAB, and that's usually been in 1 part. Last year, we produced it in 2 parts. And in the second part of that study, we were able to demonstrate that after sort of being at a flat line of around 2 or 3% programmatic in podcasting from 2019 through 2021, in 22, we started to see a real bump up to 5%, still a small number, but it was a doubling from prior years, and then we believe that we saw another doubling in 2023 from 5 to 11%. So these are still relatively small numbers for programmatic activation in a vacuum, but what they're demonstrating is an incredible amount of momentum towards increasing programmatic activation in podcasting, and that is true, as I said a minute ago, in digital audio generally. What we love about this is that it is a wonderful sign of marketers' ability to sort of do 2 things that are both equally important. On the one hand, still continue to lean in a direct sold nature, to still continue to really lean in and harness the incredible alignment that comes from, for instance, making a brand partnership with a particular podcast creator, with a series of different podcast creators whose content may be particularly suitable to the message that you're trying to bring to consumers, but then also extending that message and moving into more of an audience-focused buy across any number of different podcasts to sort of supplement the incredible intimacy and resonance that you're getting alongside the host-read partnerships. So we're watching a lot of brand advertisers come more increasingly into digital audio with the understanding that the scale is now there to find and target your highest value audiences programmatically. And it's, like I said earlier, producing incredibly powerful returns for advertisers as they continue to invest more in this channel.
No, I think that's a great point. Certainly harnessing the power of a sponsorship or host-read podcast campaign is important in a media plan, but I think what's too often overlooked is the rest of the podcast inventory that you just mentioned. I mean, if you look at the average downloads per episode just from the top 5 podcasts alone, there's a significant drop off from 1 to 5. You're talking about maybe more than a tenth is what the end downloads is for the 5th podcast compared to the top. So there's a lot of podcast inventory that exists with lower individual downloads, but those listeners are still valuable. And so how you target them is important.
They're incredible value in a couple of different ways. So, one thing to keep in mind is, a lot of people think that they maybe want to only associate themselves with the larger shows because they think that's how they get the scale they're looking for. They get, that's how they're going to actually be able to spend their budget. But what you forget is 2 things. One, sometimes the smaller shows can be the greatest shows from the standpoint of consumer response, right? You're talking about incredibly loyal, highly engaged audiences who are extremely loyal to and desirous of being supportive of the podcast creators whose content that they're consuming. And sometimes you're going to find that they will be the very most attentive people to advertising messages, and sometimes maybe even the most inclined to want to really consider an advertising message because they believe that it is a way to consciously support the podcaster whose content they're consuming. So it's incredibly important to remember that smaller shows in some respects can be maybe the best opportunities for advertisers to get bang for the buck in their media spend. But the other thing to think about in terms of those smaller shows is that when you aggregate them, and we're now talking about, let's just stick with podcasting for a moment. We're now talking about a medium where there's 135 million people a month that are consuming podcasts. You're now talking about 100 million people every week that are consuming podcasts. And of those people that are listening weekly, you're talking about people that are consuming over 8 shows per week, right? So that's several hours a week that they're spending with this medium that they love so much. They're so actively engaged. They're so actively paying attention to the content. They're also actively paying attention to those advertising messages. And as I said a minute ago, they're also sometimes really making a direct connection in their mind between maybe supporting some of the advertisers as a way of supporting the podcast creators that they're listening. So all that I say, and then in digital audio writ large, that's even bigger, right? You're talking about over 200 million people that are listening to digital audio, whether that's online radio, whether that's streaming music. And so you're talking about an ability with some of these smaller shows, these smaller audiences, when you do take an audience-based lens into the idea of investing in audio, then you're able to find great scale and activate against the audiences that you most want to reach, with people that are consuming content in that incredibly attentive way. So the smaller audiences shouldn't be thought of as like individual siloed small audiences unto themselves. They should be understand as what they are, an ability to programmatically trade against hundreds of millions of people around this country, the ability to programmatically invest in audience across your programmatic portfolio. Audio is a tremendous place to do that.
I think that's a great point, and I could not have said it better myself. I think how you target against that audience is important. Historically, you've only been able to, run, whether it's a run-of network or a genre-targeted campaign, but over the past few years, you've seen an investment from audio partners into looking at shows and genres that over-index against a certain audience, or first-party data targeting against a certain audience from podcast. So that 100 million listeners, you can really pare down to that target audience you're looking to reach across all shows. So I think it's a great channel. And I think, for us, our podcast audience network is a big part of the DAX supply offering, and certainly something that we continue to look and grow and work with.
Do you mind if I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
Is that all right? Is that okay? So say that again. Describe it again. You described it as DAX's podcast audience. What did you call it? You called it
So
something.
it's our podcast audience network. So what
Okay.
DAX does is we've gone out, we have our owned and operated podcast content management system, Captivate, owned by Global in the UK. We also partner with other podcast CMSs, the Voxnest, the Omnis of the world, and then partner with individual networks as well to aggregate all of that inventory into one point of purchase for advertisers, and then layer our targeting against that. So the DAX podcast audience network is all of that inventory bundled together.
And so I guess the part of the question that I'm most interested in, maybe I just didn't say it clearly enough, but like now that you have all that inventory aggregated together, you've bundled it together, and now you're applying your special sauce in terms of the audience targeting, like what kinds of, say, third-party data partners might you be bringing in, and how are you joining first-party data, or how are you maybe even not using first-party data and just understanding audiences relative to device graphs? I'm just curious how you're helping to build out audiences for people when they're coming to target.
Sure. So I think one of the best ways to target podcasts is to look at the individual shows and the audiences that they over-index against, right? Because, for example, if you're looking to target basketball enthusiasts and you're targeting the sports genre, that's fantastic. But basketball enthusiasts and fans also listen to other content, right? So where are those listeners across the full spectrum? We know that true crime is a top podcast genre. We know comedy is a top podcast genre. So are there shows in those genres that over-index against that basketball enthusiast audience, and identifying those and pairing them out separately into their own individual buy for advertisers?
And so some of that you're doing internally with your own tools, some of that you might be doing in partnership with other people that have that audience intelligence, but you're building that. Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is just because, in my role at IAB, obviously, I have similar kinds of conversations with people all across the industry. And as I said earlier, to me, it is just extremely exciting to hear the extent to which folks like you are creating audience targeting and audience insights tools for brand advertisers at a level that wasn't the case even when I started at IAB just a couple of years ago. Just in the last year or two, you're really starting to see, as I said earlier, brand advertisers that are coming to podcasting, coming to digital audio with a desire to take not just a show-by-show based approach, although that's still very important, but also to take sort of an audience lens. And to your point, to go and find audiences wherever they may be, not just assuming that you want to reach people who care about basketball on a basketball podcast, because to your point, they could be listening to any number of different things. And there are all sorts of tools out there that are now being made use of in ways that wasn't the case, as I said, even a couple of years ago. It's great to see.
If you look at Global, our parent company Global overall, in the UK, having to deal with the targeting challenges that came with GDPR. So with the rollout of our owned and operated global player, where people are logged in and consuming content, we'll have first-party data on those audiences, pair it with third-party data, and build out these cohorts and audiences for advertisers. So
Yep.
we can run that across the DAX network. So having that research and team that's already ahead of the curve based on the laws that are being implemented here in the US, having had those targeting challenges in the UK, and already having a product that services that gap in the industry is certainly something that I'm excited about as we begin to roll these features out.
Yeah, no, it's very cool. So I have another question that's kind of related to an additional data point from our research last year, which I'll get to in a second. But like, I find this to be the case again when I speak to many people across the industry. Some of the data that we have also says the same thing, but I'm curious about the extent to which, as people come and they take advantage of things like these audience tools that you're talking about, the extent to which they're signing back up again and maybe even increasing their investment. You know, what we see at IAB is just people that come in and they test the waters in audio, they find the water's warm, and they come back and they spend more. And as they start to understand again the full tool set that exists from both a measurement and an audience targeting standpoint that exists in audio, they tend to like what they see and they tend to spend more. I'm just wondering if you're finding that to be the case, or if there's specific stories that you have with respect to uses of some of your audience tools that have led to particularly positive outcomes and maybe unlocked, you know, even greater investment that hadn't been there before.
Yeah, I think, there are a number of case studies that DAX has put out, and we work with our partners on a case-by-case basis to create these. But when you look at when we roll out new formats or emerging formats of audio, for example, we released a webinar a few months ago around our in-game audio product, where we were able to bring on board the agency lead who ran campaigns against our in-game audio, showing the return on investment and performance and how that exceeded over the first 4 to 6 weeks of the campaign. So it's exciting to see not only these new formats hit the market, but also see them perform well. You brought up an interesting point around targeting earlier, and I think as you might be the best person for me to ask this question to, given that you work with audio and video, what are some of the targeting nuances that the IAB sees that are specific to audio that don't really exist in other formats?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I am the best person to answer it, but one of the things that comes to mind in response to that is the extent to which you can do psychographic targeting. And I guess this goes back to a certain extent to what I was saying toward the beginning of our conversation, right? Audio is a medium that you consume throughout the day, and that maybe is going to address different desires, different needs, different states of mind that you may be in as you go throughout your day. And just as an example, you may have, a late afternoon or an early evening exercise person, who's getting ready to do a strenuous workout. But as they go through their workout, they want to be either, pumped up by some music, or maybe they're not going through such a strenuous workout. Maybe they're, on the exercise bike, and then they really want to dive into something that they care deeply about. Maybe they're really into a history podcast, right? And so your ability to sort of target according to times of day and it's according to sort of a mental state of mind is something that I think is very special in audio, and that I don't know can be done quite as well in almost any other medium. So that's one thing that comes to mind. Their day part targeting is enormously important. As I say, state of mind, what you're doing, behavioral characteristics of targeting. Let's say you're in the kitchen and you're preparing dinner. That's pretty good time, right, to share very specific kinds of advertising messages as they go about the process of relaxedly preparing a dinner. Maybe it is a message specific to something involving food preparation. Maybe it is a message that just sort of aligns itself more generally with a relaxed state of mind. Maybe as somebody's preparing a dinner and they're thinking about, boy, this would be nice if I was sitting on a beach as I was doing this. Then you share something about a travel service. But I think when I think, and I'm not sure this is the answer to your question, but when I think about what's special regarding audio and the ability to do audience targeting, I think about the ability to sort of target against psychographic and behavioral characteristics of people as they go throughout their day. I think that's what comes to mind.
I think that's a great point. When you look at it from that point of view, with audio, you have a highly engaged audience, right?
Sure.
So device and channel mix is almost more important in audio than it is in other formats. To your point about reaching a highly engaged person on a podcast, or reaching someone prepping dinner, or commuting to work, those messages are different, but you still have that highly engaged audience just doing various different things depending on the time of day, device, and protocol that you're reaching them on.
Yeah, and I don't think that you can overstate the extent to which people are engaged with audio content, and you certainly cannot overstate the extent to which they feel bonded to, parasocially connected to, their favorite audio content creators. So whether that be a local radio host, whether that be a podcast host, you consistently see study after study come out and show that when surveyed, people, consistently say that their favorite people in radio, their favorite people in podcasting are the people that they consider to be the most influential in their lives, right? And that kind of influence is not only just spectacular in and of itself, but it's also pretty impressive and pretty special when it comes to brand advertisers who want to find opportunities to present their marketing messages to consumers that are leaned into those shows with the people that they deeply care about who create them.
Shifting gears a bit, putting on your genie hat or looking ahead to the future, what do you think the opportunities are in digital audio overall, and then specifically programmatically, in order for us to continue the growth trajectory that we've been on?
We take that in two parts. So the second part was programmatic. What was the first part? Just generally, what do I think the opportunities are for digital audio?
Yep.
I think one of the incredibly large, there's just a long runway in my mind for digital audio when it comes to sort of share of mind for the advertising community in terms of what you can accomplish with the additional investment in audio as it pertains to everything else you're already doing in the marketing you're doing in other channels, right? I think that what's really special for audio is the extent to which people are beginning to understand how powerfully it not only delivers outcomes unto itself, but how powerfully it then turns around and supercharges the outcomes that you're getting in other channels that you may also be marketing in. So I remember one statistic in particular, I may not get this exactly right, and this is just one statistic of so many, but I remember the folks from iHeart came and during their presentation at this year's podcast upfront, I think it was Connell Byrne who made a point of pointing out that if it was a particular campaign, and I think what they were able to demonstrate was that by taking simply 5% of a budget that had previously been allocated entirely to social media and just transferring 5% of that to digital audio, it not only brought great outcomes in the audio piece, but it then drove an 83% boost in performance in the social media that they were already investing in, right? So people's understanding of the ability to not only find outcomes in audio, but to increase the performance that you're getting in other channels because you're starting to get some of that unduplicated reach that you may not be accessing until you add audio to your media plan. I think that's a very important part of what's exciting about audio looking forward is the extent to which the marketing community can understand how important it is to have those incremental lifts that come along with audio and that boost the strength of an entire media plan. In terms of your question about programmatic, what you're starting to see is increasingly, and you know this as well as I do, right? You're starting to see increasingly robust content and identity signaling throughout the digital audio ecosystem, and that means that people in the buying community who do want to activate programmatically now have signal that wasn't previously as rich as it was in the past in digital audio. You're also starting to see a whole litany of measurement solutions and brand safety and suitability solutions at the highest possible level that are continuing to allow people to come in and do much more and invest much more heavily in this medium. I don't know how detailed you want to get on that discussion, but as you well know, there's a lot of extremely powerful measurement and really powerful brand safety and suitability filtering that you can do in audio now. Again, much more powerfully than you could even a couple of years ago, especially on the brand safety and suitability piece.
One thing we call out to our advertisers and, the hands-on keyboard trainers when they're building out the campaigns within their DSPs pertains to that brand safety targeting, right? And some of the brand safety parameters that work on video don't necessarily work with audio, right? Something as simple as enabling viewability within a campaign is going to impact an audio deal. So there's all these little nuances that I think are unique to audio, but the industry is getting caught up and catching on to what those nuances are. And it's, part of the education process for us in the market of getting advertisers to understand what that is. In regards to the passing of data points, it's interesting, from our point of view, we're passing, I believe it's 39 data points in every bid request. Probably 36 of them are relevant to advertisers or end buyers. And everyone's ingesting those data points differently, and there's always a drop off in that data through each hop of the bid process. So when you're layering on more advanced targeting, you want to get as close to the actual listener as possible. And sometimes it's more efficient to layer that targeting on the SSP side as opposed to layering it on within the DSP due to that drop in signals. But we always recommend to clients to begin by layering it on their end to find the audiences that they're looking for.
Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. And again, what I hear anecdotally, at least, is that brand advertisers are finding those audiences that they're looking for at levels they may not have expected. So another piece of information that we reported out in that phase 2 part of last year's podcast ad revenue study was that for the first time ever, the people who respond to that survey were reporting to us that the majority of their revenue was actually coming from sort of upper funnel brand awareness advertisers, as opposed to the sort of lower down the funnel sort of direct response advertisers that have really formed the backbone of the podcast medium since its inception. There's still, to be sure, an incredibly strong percentage of people who are direct response advertisers in that industry, and it's always going to be a remarkably powerful place for people to drive bottom of the funnel sales KPIs. But we're starting to see larger scale brand advertisers understand that podcasting as a generalized brand building storytelling canvas is just a wonderful, wonderful proposition. And I think it kind of goes back to what you're talking about. It goes to the understanding that there is audience information that enables you to find the people that you're looking for who are going to be most responsive to your messages. And again, that you can use the entire digital audio ecosystem, not just podcasting, as a means of, through frequency, reach, making sure that you do the kind of brand building that ultimately is the most important thing for even bottom of the funnel sales KPIs, right? Ultimately it all comes down to your ability to brand, stay top of mind, stay in the memory of consumers. And audio, as we've been talking about throughout this conversation, is just fantastic for that, because people are so leaned in and they're so engaged with the content and they're really paying attention. And when you have people that are responsive and paying attention to the content they're consuming, as we all know, by extension, there's a lot more attention that's being paid to the ads themselves.
It's funny. I never thought of this until you were just making your point. Advertisers' perception on audio is so extreme. It's either upper funnel, or for direct response advertisers, it is the absolute bottom of the funnel, right? And it's getting advertisers to say audio can be across the entire funnel.
That's
right? It's not just one of those extremes.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, honestly, and that goes back to a certain extent to some of what I said, 20 minutes ago. There is now this understanding that you can approach audio in sort of like a double-barreled fashion, right? You want to continue to lean in where you can with hosts that have built up these incredibly intimate relationships with people, create real sponsorship partnerships with hosts, but then also understand that you can activate programmatically to find the scale and the reach and the audiences that you want. And it's those two things together that allow you to achieve a truly full funnel approach to your media plans in audio. And again, I keep coming back to this, and maybe I just, I beat the drum too often, but it is the influence of the people creating the content that matters the most. And it's funny, I'm just sort of thinking about this out loud now. I never really thought about it before, but let's say you're even just listening to streamed content on your favorite streaming music platform. In that case, you're not necessarily listening to a host curate that music. You're not necessarily listening to people, sort of speak to you about what they may think as you go through the process of consuming that music. But of course, musicians themselves are the ultimate storytellers, right? And people, when you think about it, just occurred to me as I'm sitting here thinking about this, but in some respects, when you're going to go listen to music on a streaming platform, ultimately what you're doing is the same kind of thing on a weird sort of a level that you're doing when you choose to engage with a radio DJ, or that you're doing when you choose to listen to your favorite podcaster's podcast. It's ultimately going to have a story told and to sort of identify and lean into a particular idea or a particular content vertical that may be meaningful to you. And you can learn a lot about love and life just listening to music. And so again, I think that audio is a very special, intimate thing. It's right there in your ears. It's as close to your brain as you can possibly get. And the influence of both the people who create audio content and the people who sort of curate it and distribute it cannot be overstated. You hear over and over again. This is something that I actually talked about. I don't mean to ramble on, but this is something I actually talked about from the stage at the podcast upfront shortly before the folks at iHeart and others came on stage and talked about some of those stats that show how powerful audio can be for omni-channel advertisers. But one of these stats that I quoted was that in a study that had been done last year, and you mentioned, I think, Vox. Did you mention Vox earlier? So this was a study that Vox Media had done with Magna. And in that study, one of the things that I cited was that 75% of people who listen to podcasts say that the podcasters they listen to the podcasters they listen to are more influential to them than original influencers in either social media or television. And so when you're talking about that sort of influence and that sort of connection, it really pays off for advertisers. And so that's what I'll now close this thought on. So I shared that thought from the stage about the study that demonstrated the extent to which podcast listeners consider podcasting to be more influential to them than what they consume in either television, in either video. So we talked about that stat from the podcast upfront stage. And then just a couple of months later, the folks at Sounds Profitable, I don't know if you know Sounds Profitable, but it's one of the many excellent research entities that are out there that do things in the audio space. And almost as if they were sort of like, tying a bow off on that comment on the survey response from the people who said that they're more influenced by podcasters, they were able to do a study in which they went through with several large omni-channel advertisers, and they demonstrated that for all of the key metrics that you evaluate when you look at full funnel advertising, podcasting came out ahead in this study that they did, ahead of CTV and ahead of social media in terms of like brand awareness and brand lift metrics. So, I just can't speak strongly enough about the medium. As you can see, I'm a deep believer myself. I myself am a very passionate consumer of audio, and I'm not the only one. There's a lot of people out there who are really engaged when they're listening to audio, and you can see in the data what that means for marketing outcomes.
I mean, I think I am clearly biased answering this question, but the power of audio could not be overstated. And certainly you pointed to a couple of examples of that. Matt, as our special guest today, I want to see if there's any topic you'd like to cover or anything we missed that you'd like to touch on before we part ways.
So here's what I'll say, and this is just a selfish thing. I don't know exactly who your audience will be or who's looking, but as you well know, we have in the IAB Media Center a couple of very active working groups right now where we are endeavoring to try and bring together as much expertise, as much insight, as much data as we can, and put together these definitive guides about many of the things we've been talking about today, right? The extent to which audio is an incredibly powerful medium for marketers. And I would invite anybody watching this podcast who is either a member of the IAB or may be interested in becoming a member of the IAB to please consider coming and joining a couple of our working groups. One of them is called Podcasting in the Creator Economy. This is a very important working group where we are looking to make sure that we can figure out the best ways for podcast creators and brand marketers who want to align their marketing messages with them can partner together. We want to make sure that as digital marketing writ large concerns itself so much with what we call the creator economy, that everybody understands, again, going back to some of what we've been talking about here today, that podcast creators are really the ultimate influencers and among the most important creators working in the creator economy today. So please come lean into that group where we're going to be creating a guide, as I say, about the best way for podcast creators and brands to partner and the best way for brands to understand, again, that incredible return on their investment that they can get in the podcast medium specifically. The other one that I want to mention is called Getting Audio and Podcasting on the Media Plan. And again, that dovetails very nicely with what a lot of what we've been talking about here today. We will once again be producing a definitive guide there. We will be adding all sorts of information about the ways that you can measure your outcomes in audio. We're going to be including all kinds of information about the way in which you can actually model audio's contribution alongside other channels and fully understand the marketing journey that you can go on with audio. So please, if you're watching this and you're either an IAB member or somebody who would like to join that conversation and consider IAB membership, please get in touch with me. Very easy, matt@iab.com, and I would love to get you signed up with those groups.
Matt, I can tell you as a member of both of those groups, they're certainly engaging, and I'm excited to see about the content that's created as a result of that group's work.
Thank you so much. Well, really, it was a pleasure talking with you today. Thanks for having me.